Hey there, everyone. Welcome to Broadband Deployment News. The state of Alaska submitted over 300,000 challenges to the Broadband Data Collection Fabric, the serviceable locations on that fabric, and only about 15,000 or so, a little over 15,000 were accepted. So they're planning on resubmitting some of those. So the question is, when will those be reflected in the broadband map? We'll be right back. Thanks for joining me. Rick Uzzi here with Broadband Deployment News. So as I mentioned, I saw this story in, where is it here, Telecompetitor. Alaska still aims, let me see if I can close this thing here, it's pretty big. Alaska still aims to use the state broadband map to get its fair share of BEAD funding. So they, like a lot of states, have put together their own state map to try to get a handle themselves on where broadband serviceable locations are, and in addition to, where service is provided. A lot of them are doing that as well. So I'm just going to read through this and comment on it. So engineering firm Dewberry, in collaboration with mapping company Ecopia AI, Rasmussen Foundation in the state of Alaska, is working on a broadband map based on what Ecopia AI is calling an accurate, up-to-date, and complete map of every building in both rural and urban areas in the state. And of course, that's what Costquest is trying to do for every state in the country, is have this up-to-date, accurate map on every structure that is supposed to get broadband in the country, and that's called the Broadband Data Collection Fabric. It's the underlying data that internet service providers are placing their available service on top of that to create the FCC broadband map. Ecopia AI's specialty is applying artificial intelligence to satellite imagery to identify buildings. Now, that's something that Costquest did as well, and I'll mention that here in a minute. Using data from Ecopia AI, Dewberry's job is to identify broadband serviceable locations throughout the state for purposes of allocating funding for the state in the BEAD program. That program has a budget of $42.5 billion to cover some of the costs of bringing broadband to rural areas that currently lack service. And the BEAD money will be allocated based on the total number of of unserved locations in the United States. That's locations that have less than 25/3 broadband service compared to the number of unserved locations in a state, and that determines how much money they get in addition to the $100 million that every state's going to get. So this is important because you want to know how many locations are supposed to get broadband, and then you need to know how many locations do have broadband. So according to the press release, Reliable Geographic Information System, GIS data, did not exist for rural areas of Alaska, such as the unorganized borough that comprises more than 70% of the state's landmass and ranks fourth highest in population. The Alaska Broadband Map news comes only a week or so after NTIA, the federal agency responsible for administering the BEAD program, told Telecompetitor that the Broadband Serviceable Location database that the FCC made available in November would not be updated again prior to the allocation of BEAD funding targeted for this summer. So the fabric came out and then last year, and then like June or so, and then June through September, internet service providers took that fabric and then they overlaid on top of that as best they could, based on the fabric and the errors that were in there. As best they could, they overlaid the service that they provided, if they did provide service at a location, what the maximum advertised speed was, latency, that kind of thing. And then there were some challenges to that when the map came out November 18th. There were some additional challenges, and then a new fabric came out right at the end of December that incorporated some of those challenges that were made. So really entities could start making challenges. States, communities, other stakeholders could start making challenges to that first fabric mid-September. And again, the map came out mid-November, and then the NTIA was recommending that everybody get their challenges in by January, I think it was 13th of this year, to get their challenges in at that point so that it would have the best chance of getting in the next map. So we're obviously past that. Those wishing to question whether the database accuracy, here it is, accurately depicted whether a location had broadband available to it had been encouraged to file challenges by January 13th of this year, but based on the comments from NTIA to Telecompetitor, it was already too late to add locations to the database upon which the BEAD allocations would be based. And again, the internet service providers had a new fabric based on what was originally challenged, and they got that at the end of December and started, I think the window opened January 3rd to be able to start uploading their data. Unsuccessful challenges. The FCC Broadband Serviceable Location Database was created by broadband mapping company Costquest, a contractor to the FCC. One of the methods that Costquest used to create the database was to use AI and satellite imaging in a manner similar to what Ecopia did. So that's true. So Costquest, they have the same AI, I don't know if it's the same AI technology, but what they did was they had human beings going in and looking at maps and trying to identify locations that looked like they should have broadband. So they'd have different structures and roof lines, and they would mark those as having broadbands. Others they wouldn't. So if it looked like a stable and whatnot. So they tried to teach the computer what was a serviceable location and what was not on a property. And it's going to be pretty obvious in some areas. If you've got a suburban neighborhood, you got all the homes and the roof lines, that's pretty easy. But when you have maybe a farm with multiple buildings, it gets a little more challenging. So that's where the AI was supposed to help take over, I think. That plus, of course, the easy stuff the AI could do as well. Costquest's initial broadband serviceable location database, known as a Fabric, was released publicly in mid-2022, and stakeholders, including service providers and state government entities, had the option of challenging that data. And that's where a lot of these huge challenges were made. Now, 300,000 from Alaska, but only 15,000 were accepted. So that's a big discrepancy. But a lot of states did have tens of thousands of challenges that they made. And it wasn't just the states that were challenging it, though. It was any internet service providers that were looking at the Fabric that saw thousands of locations where they actually provide service. So they would have been challenging that data as well. As Ecopia explained, Dewberry filed a challenge on behalf of the state of Alaska, but only 15,074 of 378,254 challenges made were accepted. Telecompetitors learned from several other entities that filed challenges that only a small fraction were accepted for them as well. And I'm assuming that means they're looking at the broadband map. So let's see. It would really depend on when those challenges were made, because the next Fabric came out in December. So if they were making those challenges late in the process, they might not have been included in the next Fabric. It really depends on what the cutoff was. I don't know if there was. I'm trying to think of what the cutoff was for the first Fabric challenges. But like I say, they could start on September 15th, and I think they were encouraged to just keep challenging that. But at some point, the FCC had to say, okay, we need to put a stake in the ground here so that we can get the next Fabric ready for internet service providers to start uploading their availability data. So I'm not sure what the cutoff was. It could be that some of those were not included for that reason. Don't know. Here you see what the Ecopia map looked like. They've got challenge 1, challenge 2, challenge 3, I guess. I don't know what all those things mean. This is just a screenshot of that. The updated broadband map made public in early January includes locations that were successfully challenged. But according to the Ecopia AI spokesperson, through downward pressure exerted upon the NTI by elected representatives, I'm assuming that's senators, Congress people from Alaska, it does sound like Alaska is being encouraged to submit another challenge or several that include BSLs, those are broadband serviceable locations, there you go, that were previously rejected but have been manually verified as legitimate structures if they originated from Ecopia's data, or that originated from authoritative addresses and therefore are legitimate BSLs. Dewberry is using the remaining funds to have staff manually review data for preparing another challenge. We will also resubmit any authoritative address-based BSLs for consideration. So in addition to just the AI of trying to identify structures, they're manually going out. I don't know if that means visiting those or looking at those manually and determining, yeah, this looks like a location that should have broadband, plus any address information. All of that should have been in Costquest, because Costquest was looking at tax records and other kinds of items that would be the start of their knowing which locations should have broadband. So that should have been in there. Meanwhile, some stakeholders argue allowing against any additional location challenges to be considered prior to BEAD allocations by state because they don't want funding to be delayed. And the NTI has come out and said they're not going to delay that. They are still shooting for June 30th on the date when they will, at least by then, as the date as when they're going to determine how much each state's going to get. By the time states get around awarding funding to individual service providers, more accurate maps will exist, those stakeholders argue. And that's true there, I think, because the broadband map is going to be used to allocate how much funding each state's going to get, but states won't actually allocate funding to areas until later because they've got to do their 5-year plan. That's going to go back and forth between them and the NTIA. They've got to talk to subgrantees in areas. So it's going to be, the states aren't even going to get the money until sometime in late next year to early, even in 2024. And then that goes out to the subgrantees. So that will be a while. But the question is, will the states be getting the amount of funds that they deserve based on all of the locations that they have that should have broadband? So that is a question. Let's see here. Those arguing against further changes to the location database prior to the state BEAD allocations argue that all states likely have a similar percentage of missing locations, which would mean that the additional locations would have little impact on BEAD allocations. So it really won't affect the formula. And it says here that's a generalization that may apply to most states, but if there is any state that might be an exception, it would likely be Alaska, simply because there are so many remote areas that may not have been previously mapped in detail. That's true. Alaska's almost like a one-off in this whole process because of how big it is and how few people live there and how spread out they are. So, and it's very remote. So it would be difficult. That would be the hardest state, I would think, as far as trying to map broadband. Now, again, there are internet service providers in Alaska. They're already providing service, and I'm assuming Alaska would be a state that would have more locations that just don't have it. There's nobody there because you have homes spread out here and there, and you're just not going to have a broadband provider, like a fiber provider or even a cable provider or a DSL provider. You might have some fixed wireless in places if there are enough homes clustered together to do that. But I mean, if you've got these individual homes with miles and miles and miles between them, there may not be broadband service there. So in other words, there wouldn't have been a broadband service provider to go look at the fabric and say, wait a minute, I'm serving this area and you don't have it on the map. So that's going to be an unusual case for Alaska. Now, satellite broadband service would be available to them, and something like Starlink, that would be a situation where Starlink might be the right provider in certain areas. Again, if you've got a home and then you've got 20, 30, 50 miles between homes in Alaska. I don't know if that's the way it is. I'm assuming that's the way it is in some places, that people live very remotely there. Then in situations like that, satellite might be the only option. It'd be really difficult to do something, again, other than maybe a fixed wireless shot. If you've got line of sight, assuming satellite, that you can get a shot of the sky, it's going to be a little bit easier. So anyway, the interesting story here. So again, the question is going to be, even though they can go ahead and make these challenges, the NTIA is going to keep, or the FCC is going to keep looking at those challenges, and they're going to keep incorporating that into the fabric, and that's going to keep informing the National Broadband Map that we get, and it's going to get more and more accurate. But the question is, when does that get in the map? And I'm thinking it's not going to be in this next map that we're expecting sometime in the spring, maybe mid-May. It's not going to be there, and so therefore it's not going to be taken into account, most likely, when the NTIA submits their the allocations for broadband, unless they look at Alaska and they go, you know what, this is way off. We really do need to take a look at this. But if they do that, see if they say, yeah, these locations are on the map, then they probably need to determine, are there any internet service providers that are providing service there that need to upload their data into the broadband map? My guess would be no. I mean, if you've got that many locations and they were not challenged by an internet service provider already, my guess is that those could be broadband serviceable locations that just don't have service, in which case they're unserved, and maybe the NTIA could take a quick look at that and say, wait a minute, there's no internet service provider here. We've reached out to every ISP that would be in the area. There's nobody providing service to these addresses, and then maybe they can include that in the formula, because those would all be unserved broadband serviceable locations, and therefore that would increase the amount of money that Alaska would get. So that, again, it's an interesting state. It's always been interesting for broadband. It's been hard to do there because of, again, how spread out everything is, because of things like permafrost that can wreak havoc on, underground utilities, those kinds of things, because of ice, ice and snow and other stuff. So Alaska's a challenge, but they deserve to have the same kind of broadband everybody does in the country. It's just more difficult. So thanks for joining me. I appreciate it. If you're not subscribed, if you would, click the subscribe button, click the little bell to be notified when I'm live. If this was interesting, if you'd click the like button, I'd appreciate it. I will see you next time for broadband deployment. I will see you next time when I can talk. Next time for broadband deployment news. Thanks a lot. Take care. Bye-bye.